All those in favor?
Aye.
Aye.
Thank you very much.
Wow, we're already to new business?
Yeah, so the next item on our agenda, we're at new business, is the Parks and Recreation consultant study on the ferry service planning report. This particular item, I think, was generated, I don't know at how many budgets ago in conversations with the BET, but there's been a conversation over what should the plan be for our current ferry operation, replacing boats. The cost of maintenance has been increasing, and so the consultant study was included at some budget.
The current one,
The
right.
current one, fiscal 19, to be completed. And I think because there was not a specific capital request in the fiscal 20 budget, Mr. Siciliano and I agreed not to take time during our February conversations, but to schedule it at a different BET meeting so we could spend more time and focus on the information here. So thank you. Do you want to introduce the people you have?
Sure. I'd like to just take a minute and give a little background and introduce the folks. The study that we're going to be reviewing this evening and we'll have a short presentation on is really just the beginning of the conversation. So I appreciate the questions that I received today and the due diligence, but I'd like for you to see and hear the report. I'm sure that this conversation will go on for a while. It's not only has a background of history with the town of Greenwich in the sense that we've been running ferry service to Island Beach for 101 years, and we've been running ferry service to Captain's Island since 1975. So it has a long history. It has a large following of the community. It's not only an expensive proposition, it is an emotional proposition for people who are constant island goers and rely on that service. It also makes Greenwich the town that it is in the sense that this is a unique opportunity and a unique operation for a town like Greenwich to have for its residents. Obviously, it's one of the premier things that real estate show potential house buyers in Greenwich, that we have a ferry boat, we have 2 offshore islands, like they do Greenwich Point, and now including Barn Pool. These will all become very attractive operations for the town, and they have some outlying implications in trying to attract folks to want to move to our town. A couple things. As I started out to say that this is the beginning of the conversation, there was one item in next year's budget, the 1920, which was $100,000 that you appropriated and was approved last night for some dock repair at Captain's Island and some seawall repair out at Island Beach. Those are both safety issues. The money was appropriated. The work will be done in the next budget cycle. So we've taken the safety factor off the table of having some issues with the dock facilities at both islands, and that would complete that. As far as how we went along, Brian Kirsner, the Superintendent of Marina Facilities, Amy Hansen, our boating operations manager, myself, Tom Greco, who's in the back, our assistant director, put together and commissioned this study, and we've been working with Devin Santos from RACE, who's a coastal engineer, who's built a team of people to address this. Not only does this have the coastal implication, dock, it also has a boat part of it that an evaluation that Devin brought in some other folks to work with. We've worked with Devin. He's on contract with the town, and we've had a very good experience. We commissioned this back in July, and we received the original draft report in October. And we keep looking at it. I've read it a couple times. I keep finding different things, different thoughts. So if it's that kind of technical and intense and a little bit confusing for me, I can imagine trying to make this presentation because, I've been doing this for over 30 years. I kind of have the background and understanding, and you as a volunteer board, I'm sure we'll have some questions. What I'd like to do is present the report, and we maybe answer a few questions. It could take 30 minutes, but we will continue the questions. I'd like to be able to kind of have the dialogue more or less in writing, and I'll leave it up to the chair on how she feels to to kind of funnel the information. But like today, if you send us some of those questions, we can start to address them more or less in a written response back and forth. We could spend hours talking about this tonight, and I don't think that's the intent. I think it's just to get it on the table. One other thing I'd like to talk about just quickly is the background of both of the facilities that the town has out in Long Island Sound. Obviously, Island Beach was a 4-acre island. It was gifted to the town of Greenwich by the George Lauder family in 1918 as a memorial to their son George Jr., who obviously passed in the war. Okay, so we've owned that. We've been, it's 101 years that people have been using the island the residents have been using the island and their guests. Captain's Island is a little bit different. In 1966, the town acquired or purchased 13 acres from the Aerotech Corporation for $90,000. The island was owned partially by the corporation and partially by the U.S. government, where the lighthouse is. In 1973, the additional 3.5 acres where the lighthouse location was acquired by the federal government, and that was acquired by the town from the federal government. Obviously, the lighthouse was built in 1868. It's been there ever since, and we've operated the island in its current state since 1973, 74. We had seasonal caretakers out there. We had seasonal service. We were in a partnership with the YMCA. The current boat that we run to Captain's Island was owned by the Y. We took over the boat with, it was a decision of the town to take over the boat, provide service to the Y, and also provide service to the town's facility there. It's got a long history. It is unique, as I said, and with that, we're around the water. We have boat service. We have island service. I do understand the cost and expense that goes along with running this kind of operation. So with that, I'll turn it over to Devin Santos. He is the principal of RACE, and he will introduce his team and go through the report. And if you want to take a couple brief questions at the end, we can, or we can take them in writing, however you decide.
Okay.
Thanks, Jeff.
You might need this,
Okay.
as it is on.
You're using the screen,
It is
right?
on being recorded.
Okay.
So maybe we
This
should,
work?
maybe we should, you're going to put.
Yeah, we have a presentation to go on the screen.
We're going to shift then, I think, if that's all right.
Okay.
Let me just take the report with me.
Well, while people are getting shifted around and getting set up, just to follow up on Joe's introductions, my name's Devin Santa. I'm the principal of RACE Coastal Engineering. And I'm joined tonight by Chris Eggers, who's project manager with RACE, and also Jason Black and Wes Bemis, who are consultants we've brought to the team to bring naval architecture and maritime consulting expertise. And we'll speak in turn about those aspects. So a couple things. We were, as Joe said, commissioned to do this report last summer, and this report was addressing the service, the overall service to the islands, and under the presumption of service continuity. We have these assets.
Keep going, Kathy, you got this, all the way down. Down it goes. Down it goes. Thank you.
Oh. Okay, so it's the town has these assets, so it's looking how these can be managed going into the future. You can forward there, Chris. What we looked at was a number of aspects. Was essentially the vessels, the infrastructure to support the vessels, so the piers, pierheads, gangways, accessibility components, the existing service, and by service we mean routes and schedules, when the boats are going where, and we compile that to come up with the recommendations. So, that's good. Joe offered a lot of background of the islands and when they were acquired and when service started, and I would not be able to do justice to what Joe did with his tenure here. Suffice it to say, it's a unique thing this town has, and 30,000 people went out to Island Beach last year, and 3,000 people went out to Great Captains. So it's being used. It's an exciting thing that this town has. So, looking forward and how we crafted this report, those three aspects that I mentioned, the ferries themselves, the service, and the infrastructure, all are interrelated in terms of how this can be looked at going forward. And they all require their own nuanced expertise. So we'll be passing the mic around through our team here as we go and discussing the various aspects. So we're going to start with the vessels, and with that, Jason Black will take you through.
So operating to the two islands are three separate vessels. There's two. Next slide. There's two larger vessels, the Indian Harbor and the Island Beach. The Indian Harbor is the oldest vessel of the bunch. She was built in the 30s. It is 60 feet overall and draws 7 feet 6 inches of draft. Back a little bit. The Island Beach is the largest vessel, 65 feet. She can carry almost 300 people. And draws. Sorry, is that better? Draws 6.5 feet. We'll find out later why those numbers are important. The Island Beach is the workhorse of the fleet. She does daily service, hourly, 7 days a week. In addition to that, she has a 5,000-gallon water tank that provides important infrastructure to Island Beach, providing water for the concessions and restrooms out there. On that trip, she also does supply runs. So this is a very important vessel to the overall plan. Next slide. The smallest of the bunch, as Joe already mentioned, is the Islander 2. This boat only runs to Great Captain's Island. It's a 50-foot vessel that draws 3.5 feet. At that depth, she still cannot get into the pier at Great Captain's Island at low tide, but she can get in at anything but low tide, while the other vessels can only get in at absolute high tide. This is a summary of some of the characteristics that I already described. New to the list is the U.S. Coast Guard subchapter denomination, which is something regulated by the federal code that mandates certain practices for commercial vessels, vessels for hire, which boats that you have to pay to ride is a vessel for hire. So a subchapter, you can go to the next slide. Subchapter K boat is a boat that is able to carry more than 150 passengers. A subchapter T boat is 150 passengers or less. So the two larger boats are commonly called K boats, and the Islander 2 is a T boat. That will also become more important as we get into the ridership numbers a little bit later in the presentation. So once we became well versed with the vessels themselves, we took a look back through the service records over the past 5 years on these three aging vessels. Quick summary indicates that it's about $100,000 a year per boat for maintenance costs. That includes standard annual maintenance, capital improvement projects to make sure that we don't have issues forthcoming, and emergency repairs. You can go to the next one. So one of the biggest issues, or I'll say the two components of those maintenance schedules is the structural component and the mechanical component. All three boats are built of steel, which is no longer the material of choice for vessels of this type. More commonly used now is aluminum it's a little more resistive to the harsh environment that these boats live in. The Indian Harbor itself is built of a very early welded technology where the plates actually overlap themselves, which creates a lot of hard edges and makes it really hard to get protective bonding to it so the paint doesn't stick, it cracks. And as soon as that paint cracks, you have bare steel exposed to the saltwater environment, which, as anybody that's tried to unscrew their license plate after a Connecticut winter, doesn't work so well. So the town is doing an admirable job with trying to keep these boats up. But as you can see, it's very capital intensive. I guess at the end of the day, just like owning an old house, if it's something that you love, there's no amount of capital that's too much, but it may not be the best business decision if you're looking at it from an economic standpoint. In terms of the machinery on these vessels, it also suffers from age. The Indian Harbor has gone through repeated engine failures despite preventative maintenance of top-end rebuilds. Basically, you can do a planned maintenance schedule on a diesel engine that costs maybe $30,000 to $40,000 and should average about 10,000 hours of service time. With the age of these and the number of times that they've been rebuilt, you're getting less than a tenth of that actual service time out of the current situation. That's pretty much it in terms of the condition of the vessels. Most of our analysis was based on the boats themselves, but also the service records. So we would recommend, and did in the report, that a professional surveyor come out. They're able to use some more precise techniques, including audio gauge and ultrasound. They can come out and take oil samples from the engines and transmissions and a little bit more predictably evaluate kind of the needs over the next 2 to 3 years of what the cost implications may be of keeping these aging vessels in service.
Great, thanks. And so that was the vessels, and I'll carry through with a discussion of the existing infrastructure, what condition it's in, how it's used, and how that affects the overall operation. Okay, so Joe described it, but there's 3 locations where the docks are. The main landing up at Arch Street where people board and return to the mainland, and then each island has a dock. So up at Arch Street, we have 3 berthings, one for each vessel. There's also the police boats are next to the Indian Harbors, the Islander 2's dock to the south. And here we can see the Islander 2 comes into a floating dock, and you step from the floating dock to the vessel, and then to get back to the land, there's the gangway. And one thing about these gangways is that they're not currently ADA compliant. So to have full access for ADA compliance, you'd have a 12 horizontal to 1 vertical slope for the gangway, or it doesn't have to exceed 80 linear feet, which would usually control in this case. So this dock is steeper, especially at low water. And then the larger vessels, the gangways go directly to the vessel. The Indian Harbor, which is docked at the northmost location, the gangway is essentially fixed like a footbridge. It doesn't swivel, go up or down with the tide, but there is a little step stool to compensate for the tidal fluctuations. And then over at the dock for the Island Beach, in the center of the docks there, there's the gangway. This one is hinged and goes up and down with the tides, meets the boat. It is suspended from the gallows up at the top of the piles, that timber across the top, and chain falls lift and lower it to move it with the tides to meet the boat deck. And that is a manual operation, which takes a little bit of time and effort and coordination on the crew's part to move the gangway. So then after the mainland there, at Island Beach, there's a long timber pier, comes out to a fixed structure, which is old sheet piling and stone masonry, and it has 2 gangways that could typically be used. And it was rebuilt in 2013 after Sandy. The timber part was completely rebuilt, is in very good shape. The fixed pier part, the stone masonry and steel sheet piling, was not fully replaced at that time, so that is showing some aging. And Joe mentioned earlier, though, that it was already being addressed at the previous meeting. And then is back to the operation of loading and unloading passengers. So there's a manually moved ramp come off the deck to the floating dock, and that's a little cumbersome, and it's not a perfectly smooth transition, but the crew's been managing it well so that it hasn't come up as an issue. And then typically the vessel docks to the floating dock. If they're moving in supplies, it docks to the secondary gangway on the fixed pier part. And this gangway is also less than 12 horizontal to 1 vertical slope, ADA compliant at low tide. Then out of Great Captain's Island, this is only accessed by the Islander 2, and this dock was partly rebuilt after Sandy, but only the landwardmost part was fully rebuilt, and you can see the deck is showing a little more age than some other parts. So you can see some of the new piles. There's some very sound timber, and then there's some decayed timber, which is on the cross bracing. And then the big thing from a functionality standpoint on this dock is that there's about 3 feet of water at mean low water. So the Islander 2 cannot dock. And the yellow line highlights the contour where the Islander 2 could make a routine reliable travel to. And the green line is even deeper water where the larger vessels could make a reliable travel to. So the big thing with this dock location is that it's relatively short, relatively shallow water, and that impacts the scheduling, which we'll get into in the next part here. And Wes can walk us through that part.
Thank you. So the third aspect of this study that we were asked to get into was, what is the service as it stands today? How is the island being used? And sort of developing a usage profile for what is a day-to-day, what is a monthly, what is a seasonally, and how do the vessels fit into that, both with how we need them and how we need them long-term. So just more generally, at the moment, the town runs 2 direct routes from Arch Street to each island. It's currently hourly service to Island Beach 7 days a week during the summer, and then on weekends and holidays, you have half-hourly service. The hourly service is provided by the Island Beach as sort of the water bus of the fleet, as it's been referred to. And then on weekends, that's supplemented by the Indian Harbor, the older, more maintenance-intensive vessel. Great Captain's Island service is, as Chris mentioned, tidal dependent, but that gets run 4 days a week due to relatively modest but steady ridership that tends to prefer Friday, Saturday, Sunday, Monday service. Now, the geographic considerations, if we'll just go back one, for the region, is that of the roughly 2-mile trip to Island Beach, half of that is contained within a no-wake zone there in inside Indian Harbor. The other half of that portion can be run at a service speed. Going to Great Captain's Island, there's a reef and a no-wake zone to the north of the island that forces the ferry to make a more roundabout route, which leads to a longer travel time. You need a little bit of a faster run to get there. But to sort of look into the day-to-day aspect of this, we took 10 years of data for the overall routes and 4 years of data from every single trip that the ferries took during the month of July, which we determined to be sort of a good representation because all 3 ferries were running. There was a major holiday in the middle, and it was sort of a good comparative data set. What we found was that, specifically with Island Beach to start, there's really historically strong service and requirements during the middle of the summer, during July, when ridership is roughly 12,000, has been roughly 12,000 every July for the last 5 years. You have a slightly waning shoulder season patronage, but that's sort of in keeping with the trend of everyone's schedules these days. One thing to really note, and one of the impetuses of this study, was that there have been notable high-profile maintenance failures that have forced schedule changes during these time periods, particularly July. And those are reflected in sort of those route statistics there on the bottom, where you'll have the Indian Harbor run 200 trips one year and then 80 the next, because they were out for half of the month of July because of those age-related maintenance failures that Jason sort of alluded to. More specifically, on Island Beach, on a per-trip basis, we started developing a usage profile of the island and the ferries. The average trip, and I mean I stratified the data out so that I called out the top 10% of trips and then the average 90% of trips. The average 90% of trips you're running with a little more than 20 persons on board. The top 10% of trips, and they run about 10 trips a day, so you think this is the first trip, the last trip, something like that, run with about 70 people on board. Now, that's pretty strong, and that's a good average to be running for. But then, tying it back into the vessel classification perspective of the United States Coast Guard and how big do these boats need to be, I broke out trips over 150 passengers and trips over 100 passengers. So roughly 4% of all trips had over 150 passengers. That's that subchapter K breakpoint. However, 1 in 8 trips, 12%, had over 100 passengers, which is showing that there's a really strong level of demand at that 100 passenger per trip mark to Island Beach. Moving over to Great Captain's Island, again, we have extremely historically steady ridership data. The standard deviation in ridership numbers year to year was very, very low, and it's a very regular group that, every trip has 5 to 7 people on it during the majority of the day, and then those first trip of the day, in this island's case, the last trip before the tidal blackout window, which we'll get into in a second, those are running at 25 people, so about half the capacity of the Islander 2 ferry, which is 48. That is sort of compatible with what the usage profile of that ferry is, and it seems well suited for the task of running to Great Captain's Island, with the exception being the depth problem, which I found the best way to illustrate that was to just call out in red where you can't get to the island. And it's a rolling blackout with the phase of the moon and the tides that advances 1 hour every day. And it's 3 to 4 hours where no ferries can access that dock, which, if you're the general public, trying to understand that 1 hour advance every day has led to low ridership on that route, has led to confusion about the schedule, and it's also leading to that mindset of, if I go out to this island, am I going to be stranded there for 4 hours? How am I managing my schedule during the day? Maybe I'm just going to prefer to go over to Island Beach, where I can get on and off whenever I want at half-hour increments. This, in my opinion, is contributing to generally lower utilization of Great Captain's Island. So where does this take us? And I'll tie my end in a little bit and then hand it back off to Chris. From a routing and scheduling point of view, one of the areas that we were asked to consider, which has been considered by reports done for the town in the past, was the inclusion of a triangle route. The idea that perhaps if we went down from 3 ferries in the town fleet to 2, you would be able to run one of them on a route that goes from Arch Street to one island to the next island and back. With the existing equipment, I mean traditional ferries that run at a speed of about 10 miles an hour, which is what the town fleet does, it takes approximately 90 minutes to do that trip. This is based on town employees going out and doing it in those vessels as an experiment. In order to be able to maintain that 1 hourly service to both islands, the vessel would need to operate at approximately 18 to 20 knots on the open water periods outside of those yellow no-wake zones. Now, the other requirement to be able to run this triangle route on an hourly basis would be extending that Great Captain's Island pier into the deeper water, where it can be accessed at all tide periods and not have that rolling blackout period. That being said, it's a consideration, and you would be required to have a faster ferry if you went down into a two-vessel environment, which was one of the questions that we were asked to answer in our report is, would the town benefit financially and mechanically and in terms of reliability from reducing the size of the fleet from 3 to 2? As for more general recommendations, I think Chris has some thoughts on that.
So, starting at the Great Captain's Island and the pier there, we looked at some options for extending the pier and different locations where that could be done. Concept one was in place where the existing pier is, extended out longer. And then we went around concept 2, 3, 4 to the east. We didn't look at anything on the south because of the fouls there in the little cove and the exposure to Long Island Sound. Concept 4 is also more exposed, which makes it less favorable. And essentially, the existing pier location is short, but to reach a deeper water, it would actually be still one of the more efficient locations. The other locations actually need to be longer to reach a suitable water depth. They also interfere with the existing mooring, and the vessels would be navigating around some of the shoals and rocks. So all said, the existing location is fairly well suited, and locations farther to the east also have the disadvantage of relocating where people land and access the island relative to the few amenities that are there. So this is the existing location for Great Captain's Pier with the shallow water at the floating dock. And then this is what the extension would potentially look like, bringing the floating dock out to deeper water so it could be fully accessed. And also, during that extension and lengthening, adding a longer gangway, which would allow ADA compliant access. One thing, the ADA compliance in this study was essentially limited to the pier. So it gives people on and off the boat onto the pier. Up island landward facilities weren't part of the study, but could be potentially an issue. And then likewise at the mainland and at Arch Street, we'd recommend putting in a longer pier, again for the accessibility. Due to the police docks trying to berth all the vessels, maintaining the upland access for the police station access and the pathway there, the best fit was essentially this little diagonal dock running near shore parallel. But that would have the benefit of increasing the ramp length. And then a similar idea at Island Beach. The existing pier is pretty well suited. We'd be switching out the gangway and relocating the float and mooring piles farther out to accommodate that longer length. And the other thing that also need to be improved would be the ramp from the deck to the floats. Make those smooth transitions, take the little steps out. So looking at the vessels, the piers, the ramps, we came up with 4 options in the report. Option D was the last option in the report. We're starting within the presentation because it's going to be the most familiar based on what we've been talking about. And essentially that is no action, no improvements. Keeping the existing boats, maintaining them as necessary, running the 2 direct routes to the islands. So we had an estimate of ferry maintenance and upkeep of about $2 million. This is over 5 years. We do recommend moving forward with the access improvements, and we have a contingency. So about a $2.9 million budget item for 5 years. The pros are that these are owned boats. Everyone's familiar with the operation and the schedules and the nostalgia. The drawbacks are reliance on old vessels. Those maintenance costs are estimates based on previous years, and they do include stocking up on spare parts and ongoing deck improvements to the Indian Harbor. But overall, it's a reactionary maintenance, so improving the engines as problems come up, not doing it more proactively. So you'd risk spending the money and having less reliability due to the age of the vessels. And the pier at Great Captain's would remain shorter, so that schedule would remain limited and service would remain limited. So another alternative was option A, which is essentially to buy a new boat that can run 18 to 20 knots, which is notably faster than the current speeds of the existing vessels, repower the Islander 2, so put some new engines in, new parts in, go over it there, retire the Indian Harbor and the Islander 2. So run 2 vessels, which would run on the triangle route for the new vessel, and the Island Beach, under its repowered service life, would run as well and pick up some of the extra demand times, the busier seasons, and just help shoulder the passenger loads. So breaking that out, we'd estimate about a $3.5 million ferry cost to construct the new vessel, which is based on talking to some of the shipbuilders that have reliably done these kind of boats. And then about $0.3 million to repower the existing vessel to remain in service. Ferry upkeep and maintenance remains at $1.6 million. And we recommend improving the Great Captain's pier, making it longer, and improving the other ramps as well. And then the contingency at the bottom brings it up to about $8 million. The note on the ferry upkeep and maintenance is still a relatively high number over these 5 years. Part of that is over the first 2 years of continued reliance before the existing vessels could be retired. So we'd still need to stock up on parts, do maintenance on those vessels to keep them seaworthy in service for a few years, and continue to replace the deck on the Indian Harbor. Right, so option B would also involve a new vessel. This one would be a little less aggressive on its speed capabilities at 10 to 15 knots, and the routes would be direct to the islands. We'd only retire the Indian Harbor under this scenario, and then the Islander 2 and Island Beach vessels would be repowered. So the advantages are we'd have a new vessel, which would increase reliability. The old vessels would improve their reliability as well due to the repower. And we minimize putting money back into older assets, as the Indian Harbor is about 80 years old. And we'd increase the schedule access to Great Captains, add more versatility on which vessel could get there and what the schedule could be. The drawbacks are the cost of the new vessel, and we're still operating 3 vessels under this scenario versus 2 under the option A scenario. So again, the ferry cost is the same. The repower goes up to about $0.4 million, $400,000 or so, which includes the larger vessel and the smaller Islander 2, which would be less. And again, the same ferry upkeep and maintenance, except we're keeping the 2 boats on, plus the new boat. And again, that includes carrying cost over the first few years before the new ferry can be procured to keep every vessel seaworthy. And then the infrastructure, again, under the scenario, Great Captains of Island Pier would be extended, and we also have a 25% contingency again on every option. So option C is to keep all the vessels similar to the option D, except improve them, repower them, and continue to run the same route. So we'd have the same vessels, but new engines, some new mechanicals. But the hulls would still need an improvement over time in the maintenance budgets. The advantages are we'd have repowered vessels, improve the reliability of the vessels we do have. Increase access to schedules at Great Captain's Island by extending the pier, and similar cost option D, but more predictable is a lot of the maintenance, repowering costs would be done upfront, making them more reliable versus more of a reactionary repair breakdown kind of scenario. The drawbacks are, again, continued reliance. They'd be repowered, but they're still the old hulls, older vessels, and continued operation cost of 3 vessels. So the repower, the new ferry cost has gone into this option. Repowering the 3 vessels costs about $600,000 per estimates. The upkeep and maintenance is, again, $1.7 million, which involves spare parts, ongoing maintenance that's required for the decks and hulls, and keeping them in service while they're being repowered in the off-season, during the first seasons. And again, the infrastructure cost includes extending Great Captain's Island. So that comes out to about $4.3 million over the 5 years. So in summary, these were the 3 options. And essentially, the big driver in the cost is the new vessel. The big advantage of the new vessel is faster, more reliable, and it would open up the potential to reduce the total fleet from 3 vessels to 2 operating vessels if the Great Captain's Island Pier is also extended. But the vessel count can't necessarily be reduced. We can't run the triangle route with the existing pier location and length. So, and based on a vessel performance, reliability, option A or B are the most attractive from that standpoint. But that comes at the cost of the new vessel. So that concludes our information. Go through some of the particulars.
I wanted to ask one clarification. In the document, you talked about the different requirements the town has for a K vessel versus a T vessel. And I got the impression that currently we don't meet that standard for the K vessel, or that we're not performing all those functions. I don't know if that's true or not. But
No, I don't believe that's the case. I think
Okay.
that the way the vessels are set up and the way the protocols are set up, the Coast Guard does regular inspections of vessels and boarding and unboarding. They review logs, manning requirements, and if there was a deficiency, it would need to be corrected before the vessels could continue in operation.
so all the training, I guess I was looking at some of the
Yes.
training things, we're performing those. I just wasn't clear about that. And we have both Island Beach and Indian Harbor are both K. Yes, they're both K. So some of the recommendations would move one from being a K vessel to a T vessel, which does have some savings, I guess, in the operation. I also wanted to note that your financial recommendations, you pointed out that the first few years and all of the recommendations include the cost for maintaining the existing fleet. So you don't really see the full benefits of the maintenance costs coming down until probably the next 5 years, as we're looking at those things. I'll let other people ask questions. I'm sure I have some more, but Mr. Dick.
I love going to these beaches, it's the greatest thing in islands. You talk, you're super interesting. You talk real briefly about cataracts. If you were to do the 2 expensive options, you find a new ferry and hard repair, $100 passenger
Yeah, we believe that the operational capital required for a catamaran would be less. Cost to construct a vessel is nearly identical.
Mr. Deuce.
It's still only 3.5 feet deep at mean low, which means on spring tides, it could be a foot lower than that, 2.5 feet deep. If we ended up, and our report didn't get so specific into the type of vessel, but if we ended up with a jet drive catamaran, we would have draft issues and issues of sucking in sediments into the jet drives. If we went with shafting and propellers, we would have draft issues. So I think for routine reliability, 3.5 feet really isn't deep enough.
Would there be a regulatory challenge lengthening both here?
I don't believe so. I mean, the state regulations are favorable to public access to water-dependent uses, provided they don't interfere with navigation, riparian rights, and none of this would. So everything, as I see it, is compliant to what the state proposes and wants.
Well, Bill, go ahead.
Sorry. A lot of work on capacity there. The figures show that for the big ferries to the small islands, 90% of your trips are 23 people. You have a 300-person capacity ferry, so 90% of your trips are running under 10%. Yeah, so why are we buying that big ferry? One of your biggest issues is safety and emergency address. So you need to be able to get the people off the island in order to do that fast vessel. Multiple times in a short period of time. One large vessel. That's interesting. It's a real concept. We ever had such an evacuation event in our island. You know, by 30 years here, I mean, there have been pop-up storms and things like that where we've had capacity return trips from the island. And usually if we're having a hurricane or some kind of predictable storm, we don't run. But for those few times that we have, 1,000 people, 1,200 people on a Sunday, we get a pop-up, there will be a waiting line of people to get on that boat. We try to we have a plan for shelter in place. But that's kind of the reaction, So the boats were really built for not the hourly operational service, but for those few times that we have, that situation. Or similarly on like evenings, like on a Sunday evening, the numbers escalate. It's the last boat coming off the island. It's a great summer day. People don't want to come, so we'd run over capacity on 149 passengers. We couldn't run over capacity. We just have to make multiple runs to get everybody off at the end of the day. Right. Because you don't book a reservation to leave, you actually have to figure, you're not sure how the day is going to flow as far as people coming and going. That's why the boats are built at the size they're built, so that we can handle most crowds, most situations. In my career here in town, I will say that there have been multiple times, not an enormous amount of times, where we, on a Sunday night, we'll run the last boat in, and we'll have to go back out, pick up the rest of the people, and bring them back in. And it's usually about 50 or 60 people. So if you have over 300, and you have a crowd of 350, closer to 400 people at 7 o'clock in the evening, you're guaranteeing yourself that you're going to run an extra boat to get everybody off.
I'd just add one more thing to that. With the island beach, the motor vessel Island Beach in particular, on board that, below the decks, is the water tank that supplies all of the water to the island. There's no aquifer out there. And so building that into the scale of the boat presumably helped push it into that subchapter K range when it was originally commissioned in the 50s. That's helpful.
Yeah, no, Ms. Tarkington.
So in this your work. You explained why you used the month of July. But if you were using June or August, when we've got, kids in school, both June and the kids now go back to school that last week of August, what percent of the ridership, say in June, do you have of July? I mean, again, you explain why you didn't do the data, but if you were to guess, and the same thing, what percent of the ridership do you have in August of July? Because I assume it's basically Memorial Day to Labor Day.
Yes. The other purpose for choosing July, before I answer your question, was that part of our analysis included a per person, per round trip cost data, which went into that report. And so to define 1 month where all 3 vessels were operating full-time through the month so that we could draw comparative numbers in the cost section for those vessels, that was part of why we chose July. If I had to go back and put a proportion of the ridership by month, I would say roughly 1/3 of the riders come in July, roughly 1/3 of the riders come in August, and then I would break that other third up between the shoulder seasons of the second half of June and the first half of September.
Just to add to that, we did get the ridership data and all that information we got during the budget hearings from Parks and Rec. I can reshare that chart, which I
Thank you,
have.
because my memory isn't that good to remember
have it.
that. Maybe I didn't focus on that. And then, can I answer another
Yes.
one? Just sort of related on the ridership. So when I see the riders, and I'm not because I'm taking the boat, but our ferries on weekends, we'll call it Saturdays and Sundays in the summertime, I note that in the morning, many people are coming off of the trains and walking down to the ferry boats. Do we have any sense of how that mix has changed from local residents to non-local residents? Can you tell from the tickets you sell, Joe? And can you give us more detail on that?
We can provide you that information, and, because we do know how many day passes or ticket, non-resident passes are being sold for the ridership, Well, we can do that. I can't do that off the top of my head today, but I'd be more than happy to
No, I didn't.
That
I
was
thought
part of
these
it.
were,
That was in the data that was
It is.
given.
that
to
was
us.
also in the data.
we provide it, but we'll make sure that you have it, okay?
Okay, right. Thank you very much.
Mr. Mason.
Couple things I'd like to, longtime Parks and Rec, couple things I'd like to note. The schedule, the season is a lot shorter, and I go back to somebody whose first job was on those ferry boats. And the season has gotten shorter. We used to run weekends a month before school got out, and the school year got later, and school starting earlier because of the change schedule. So we really need to look at that. But the thing that I haven't heard is I haven't heard of a dredge option. I know with the ADA app, but we haven't heard of a dredge option at Captain's Island. I know it's rocky out there. I'm very familiar. I think we haven't looked at added revenue. The town has talked for a long time about cruises to nowhere and renting it out. I don't even know if we publish a fee on that. I know we've done some of that with the seniors, but I think that's something that there was a lot of talk of, and there was talk of a Coast Guard permit issue running outside of the route that we have, but I think that needs to be considered. And I also don't know exactly when we do campouts on the island. When do you rent? Do you count that as one trip? Because there's a when the scouts do campouts on the island, I don't know if they count the head. I think they actually just put them all on one run out, and they sleep out, and then they come in on.
Every individual passenger gets counted individually. So
Okay.
it doesn't matter about the run, it matters about the number of passengers on that run. So for Coast Guard reporting, we have to report every passenger that goes out and every passenger that comes back in, and that's a monthly report we submit to U.S. Coast Guard.
And the numbers got to balance.
And the number should balance, because otherwise you're missing it. But and sometimes they don't, because people go home on personal boats and do other things.
No,
The issue that when you talk about the season, Mike, there has been, we've always started the ferry service, at least in my tenure here, second Saturday of June. We used to start off with 2 boats to Island Beach on the second Saturday of June. Then when we acquired the Islander 2, we put that one in the mix. And because of school schedules, graduations, and all that other things, I mean, the upcharge of staffing the boats, maintaining the boats, fueling the boats, just for that second Saturday in June until about the 20th or so, or thereabouts, is really, it's just not the ridership to support that, the additional cost. On the other side of the equation, we always ran to the 15th of September. And we used to run full service till the 15th of December until you see how people's life changes. Now college, back in the day, college used to start in September. Now it starts in the middle of August. And so people have changed their lifestyles, their schedules. It is a big family vacation time before school starts. So we started to look at those numbers and started to tweak the service. But you are right. In the past, and I'm talking about years and years ago, that was the second Saturday of June to the 15th full operation. But we've made some changes, and just to try to, get through some efficiencies, not only from staffing, and, operations of the boats, and additional maintenance costs, fueling, and those types of things. So,
Right. And
so we made those changes along the way as kind of negotiations and looking at how we can kind of manipulate the cost a little bit so it's not so cost prohibitive.
the last thing was that I didn't see an option there. We had looked at designs on some ferry boats, some travels, and we had some designs back in the Parks and Rec days. I saw nothing about repowering is normal. We should be doing that anyway, but I haven't seen anything about a full restoration. Just pull that 1930s boat out and have it completely taken down to zero and rebuilt. Because,
I think generally you're doing that over the course of time.
right, I'm just
So-
saying, formalize it.
We built the boat.
We built the boat.
In the 81 years that it's been in operation, we built the boat. I should say.
Okay, Ms. Oberlander.
So the numbers that these guys are using is, one ride.
It's a round trip.
I normalized the data into round trip.
It's really basically regulatory in the sense that, if you're talking about, we have to plan, in this case, once you commit to the service, you commit to the whole thing. All the boats that we operate for passenger service are licensed, the captains are licensed, and Coast Guard regulations would not permit us, in the event of an emergency, to use an unlicensed boat to transport passengers. The reason why we have this redundancy, some of it, is because, if a boat goes down and we have a full island with the folks, we need to be able to get them back, so.
I understand why you think you just said it's a regulatory requirement. I'm saying that the regulators require municipalities to provide marine service to be able to remove from an island half of the number of people that are on capacity. That doesn't make any sense. I guess I'm wondering.
No, that's not what we're saying.
I think his point was that he didn't believe the regulatory environment allowed them to use privately owned vessels to transport for-profit passengers.
That's correct, that is my statement.
I would say trying to compare this service to other communities is difficult because it is an extremely rare public service that Greenwich is providing. A private operator would, and this is I'm speculating, but I imagine that they would perform what is safe, and if that includes sheltering in place on the island, that would be what they would do. If you were to say Nantucket or Martha's Vineyard, there's no, I'm sure there are emergency evacuation plans, but that doesn't go into the scope of the size of the vessel that they procure for those islands.
They're not sizing their vessels
No, they're not. And one of the anecdotal remarks we got from the town captains was that if given the choice between doing a shelter-in-plan option and potentially getting people out on the water when a storm was advancing, they would prefer a shelter-in-place in the facilities on Island Beach or Great Captain's Island rather than potentially being caught out in a storm, which is a discretion of theirs. They size their service based off of the usage profile of the island, and which was sort of what we were attempting to get into here, in particular with Figure 10 there, of just how do the high capacity trips break out.
I don't really know of any other providers that do what we do. When you're talking about, Block Island ferries, all of these other ferries that are out there, they're licensed and they have an operation that can run 24 hours a day. We don't have that operation. So that there is a point where, not only from an insurance standpoint, from just an operational standpoint, that we would not want to run after dark if we could prevent that. So on these evenings where people don't want to leave, I mean, we know, we're watching the counts on the last 4 or 5 boats, and excuse my back, but we're watching those counts. We can make some announcements to folks on the island, says, a few boats left, plan accordingly, those types of things. But there have been situations in my career here, and when I was the head lifeguard at Island Beach for a long time, that we ran a secondary boat on Sunday evening. That means that we went out, picked up the 300 passengers, put them on the boat, dropped them off, and went right back out and got the rest of them. Not unless you can personally tell people they have to leave. I mean, right.
Let me ask it,
I've been around a long time. I haven't seen any of those providers do that. And we're talking about larger ferry services.
just to move on to another topic, you say that the service we provide is very unique. What other municipalities in the state of Connecticut, are there other town-operated ferry services or most private?
We've scratched our heads, and even the private ferries are more akin to the Bridgeport Port Jeff or the Block Island ferry or the ferries to Martha's Vineyard that are carrying cars and vehicles and going to inhabited places. There's a recent comparable that we were also involved in Bridgeport, which was when Pleasure Beach reopened, and that was taking trips to taking people out to Pleasure Beach. Similar, it was attached to the mainland through a barrier island, but it was not accessible by vehicles. That is now defunct, I believe. So it didn't survive, and that had a much shorter run. It was running from one side of the old Pleasure Beach Bridge to the other. Mm-hmm. So it was I believe it was a 50 or 60 person vessel, but its cycle time was, I think, around 10 minutes.
Right. Does no
One of the other things that came about over this long period of time is that there was some interest at one time of somebody running fast ferry service from Greenwich Harbor to Manhattan. And that was a conversation and someone's wish and hope that they could make it work, because obviously you have 300 parking spaces right across the street. You have the Showboat, at the time it was the Showboat, now it's the Delmar. I'm aging myself here in the sense that all of this sounded really great, and what we had a very frank discussion with was someone who wanted to come in and say, we'll provide service to the islands in lieu of being able to use Arch Street as a docking area to pick up commuter passengers to take them to Manhattan. Conceptually, it was a great idea. Financially, they didn't want to touch it because obviously their main focus would be the trip from Arch Street to Manhattan and back, and then this trade-off to run services to the island or both islands, and as the offset for a lease or some other financial arrangement to use the docking facility at Arch Street. It interrupted what they really wanted to do, which was 12 months out of the year run a fast ferry to Manhattan.
Right.
And we felt in the conversation that their whole focus was about that, and the island's ferry service would be secondary and really wouldn't service our residents. And eventually they kind of said, we're going to go to Stamford, which it didn't really work there either. So they were just looking for these convenient locations with all the other amenities, hotel, parking, easy access to 95. And when you think about the Arch Street location to run a commuter service, it's all right there. The train's there, but financially it wasn't going to work. And we have had one serious proposal like that over my career. It comes back to the same thing. You're a seasonal operation. It interrupts what our really mission is that we want to provide commuter service, and that was their focus. So,
Mr. Deuce and then Mr. Goss.
Earlier, I forgot to thank Devin and his team at Race for an excellent presentation. I always like looking at these diagrams. This is really a question for Joe. I think there's another option here that was not addressed, and that is, frankly, have you considered closing down service to not Beach, to Great Captain's Island?
well, I mean, over the years, there's been discussion. In 1985, John Margaret was the first selectman. John Margaret was the first selectman, and there was an actual cut to eliminate the service to Great Captain's Island. So this is how the story goes. I was there. It was cut. So this is how it worked. First day the island's supposed to open on the second Saturday of June, passengers are looking for the Captain's Island boat. No boat. Second Saturday, no boat. 4th of July is approaching. John Margaret is receiving an enormous amount of phone calls at his house saying, what happened to the boat? And why did the money get cut? So I was there. I was at the dock today. John shows up at the dock and says, how much is it going to cost to put that boat back in operation? I said, well, I'll give you a quick calculation, but in the 80s, it was probably $20,000 per captain and crew and some fuel. We already owned the boat. It was already insured. Just a matter of getting it going. And how many days a week can you run it? I said, well, like how about Friday, Saturday, Sunday, and Monday? He goes, you can put that into service for next week? And I go, yeah. He says, do it, and I'll figure out where to get the money from. So that's how it went, because there was so much outcry from the folks who wanted to use the service and expected that the service would be there for them. The islands get packed away, the boats get packed away in September, and folks kind of lose track of that until the next year, and then the budget cycle takes place, and folks figure out, wow, this is what I assumed I was getting, and now I'm not getting it. That was that scenario back in the 80s. Since then, we've abbreviated the schedules. We've done things like that. We've looked at the ridership during the shoulder seasons, try to make accommodations to minimize the expense. It's all of that. At the end of the day, it's still the 3-boat service, and it still has some, definite restrictions, especially with the ridership at Captain's Island when we have approximately a 4-hour blockout.
When we think about the presentation here, this is focusing on one aspect of the decision, and I think you and I spoke about this really. The decision on what to do about the boats is a broader question. It is the business question. It is what amenity, at what cost to the town. Right. The expectation for residents is the right balance here. And that the study clearly states the premise was continuing the service levels that we have now and what are the options to be able to do that. And I appreciate that. I think the work for Parks and Rec and everyone else in the chain will be decide what the balance is really for the amenity and the service as we look going forward, because this is clearly one of those probably more optional town services that are provided, very valuable, very appreciated, but it has to go into the mix of everything else the town's providing. And that's going to be part of the work as you start developing more and more of the proposals.
when you start looking at closing facilities or doing things like that, we still have an asset, say, that scenario about closing Captain's Island, we still have an asset out there. We have a lighthouse, we have other facilities out there. We probably have a liability once we allow people to go on the island, as far as whether they're going on a town boat or their own boat, as far as lifeguarding and first aid and oversight and a few other things. I do know that between the time that the town acquired the property from the Coast Guard and the town went into more of an operational operation at the Captain's Island, there was hundreds of thousands of dollars worth of damage done to the lighthouse by vandals. The house was boarded up, people broke in, lighting fires inside. They were it was just a lot of pirates on the high seas, as we might call it. People just not not being respectful to the facility. We would have to look at that as a town and see how much exposure we really would
Right.
want.
Mr. Goss, you had a question?
Can you show that triangle again, that triangle route? So I had one question. I was out in my boat one time, and it was kind of high tide, but I was thinking it was probably the last run of the day, but there's an actual channel, isn't there, that goes from Island Beach, like as the bird flies, an improved channel right there that goes this way. Because the Indian Harbor actually went and did the last run for Captain's Island by simply, I don't want to get up there and point, but in other words, it's a direct route from the island, and is there some reason like? Well, no.
Through there at the right time.
Well,
You can.
well, still, when they have races, sailboat races, they all use that same route too. I know where I know boats more there, but I'm just saying it's been a couple of years. But I was surprised that the Indian Harbor took that route and it docked. Then it went out the way that Islander 2 does, and then went out. But it was anyway. I was wondering why that route wasn't considered. Okay. All right, and then I have a second question. It's kind of along your lines and Mr. Mason's line, but I'm kind of hampered because I grew up here and I probably have some baggage and preconceived notions about Great Captain's Island, but I think the town does everything they can with it. But first off, the beach is always seaweedy, and it's just Mother Nature. It's not anything you're doing. In other words, it just can't be used real well. That faces Long Island. And you were talking about bringing up regular service as opposed to however you classify it now. But I'm just I'm not sure if you'll get a lot more people. There's no concession stand. The beach isn't really that usable, and I always think it might always be a really nice place and an asset for the town. But it's kind of like a picnic area and a mooring area for private boats, and so that's like a bigger consideration. Kind of like maybe we need to decide what's what. One thing that's different than you were answering his question, there are a couple of private boats now that do go out with people on them, and I guess it's not out of, as opposed to back in 1980, whatever you're talking about. So, maybe it's possible that, if we did cut back, that you'd cut back on not only the boat, but also the crew, the lifeguards, et cetera, too, But anyway, the bigger consideration is just whether we can really boost the attendance there a whole lot, no matter what we do, I think, So, and just one more thing, I have a paraplegic friend. He's a great guy, just a little younger than me, but we've gone out to Island Beach several times each year, and I know it's not perfect, the setup, but it wasn't a problem. So I just wanted to throw that out.
Are there further questions? Jill?
That's good.
A lot of what I hear from people is the fee schedule. We charge $7 for residents. We charge the same for out-of-town residents, plus an additional fee for parking and et cetera. I grew up using the beach I mean, I have pictures when I was literally 6 months old on the beach. It used to be every weekend, every day, we would go out to the beach because it was affordable for families. I hear from people who have 3 or 4 kids that might not qualify for the free rides, but qualify for the $7. And it becomes cost prohibitive for them to go out, which I think also contributes to a lot of the decline in ridership. I know for me, I used to go every time I could out to the island. I might go once or twice a year now because I'm not going to pay $7 when I can go to Todd's Point and not pay anything. Other than my beach pass. A lot of what I hear from people is that we pay taxes to maintain these boats, yet we're being asked to pay the same amount of money that an out-of-town person. And I know that the feeling is because of the lawsuit that we had, we have to keep the fees up. But is there any thought to restructuring the fees to give people credit for the taxes they pay so that people will want to use it more rather than pay the $7 every time?
As it kind of goes, the evolution of this is that the boat used to be a nickel. Then it was a quarter. Then it was $1. Then it went to $2, and you're just trying to keep current on the time and the time schedule of how time passes and the expense. The issue is that obviously we allow all seniors to ride the boat for free. Okay, you get your senior pass, you go on the boat. There's no ride ticket. We'll be there close. I know. So that's correct. And so we'll be rounding that corner for that free ride. But at the end of the day, it's a decision that the town can make. We're not getting rich over the revenue of the operation of the ferry service.
I'll make the other argument, though, Karen, for the percentage of people that are using this, the rest of the town is subsidizing their use of this service because the cost to deliver it is way more than the $7 per ride fee. And
114, or something like that, 110.
I'd say personally, the only reason I even buy a beach pass is because I have to pay for parking when I buy a guest pass. So now I buy a beach pass and I go once a year.
Good plan.
Maybe. But so there are all kinds of users of all these facilities, and I think we have to be fair to all of them.
It's something we can look at in the ongoing conversation. So for tonight, this is a lot of information. The report is even more technical than the presentation. And so where do we go from here? In the 15-year capital plan, we've put placeholders for some of these initiatives. That doesn't mean that they're going to happen. They're going to happen the way we put them in there. But we figured we need to start thinking about the next 5 or so years out, just for planning purposes, for discussion purposes. Otherwise, this conversation will continue for the next 10 years. So we put some placeholders in the 15-year plan. But what we really, as I said in the beginning, the $100,000 to do the dock repair at Captain's Island and the stone repair at Island Beach has been appropriated. It will be available July, and we will get that done over next winter. So that there's not a real emergency, but the equipment's getting older, the vessels are getting older, and we're not making any progress on coming up with an alternative. So what I think we can do is that there's not this big emergency and to have to do anything right today, but we need to kind of continue this conversation. So we would be glad to kind of provide some more information. You can, whether Leslie, you want to get the information to you and you can kind of send it to us, or however you'd like to do it, and answer some of these questions like the fee or some of the other things that came up about the island. How much does the island operation cost, and what kind of insurance liabilities if we close something we have. We can start to gather that some information. I think it's going to end up being part of the conversation anyway. Right. Let's get it on the table. But we really need to think about our plan for the next 5 years because we will undertake some additional steel replacement costs. We'll have some more continuing engine failures that will interrupt services. You only have roughly a 3-month timeframe where you need the boats and you want to be consistent. And so those are the kind of things that we really need to address. And, so we have, as I said, we have a little time, but I'd like to keep the conversation current and start to, for whether it's the next budget cycle or the following, and make some kind of decisions on moving in some direction.
Right, and I think I wanted to summarize, but just to concur that I think this ends up being a business plan for this operation and the role it plays in town and the level of investment. I know the costs are not easy to segregate because in Munis we're not separating the island operation from Todd's Point. But I think all of the issues that have come up tonight, and I'm sure there are more, feed into that analysis. And I'd rather have the decision of what our level of service be dictated by a decision than dictated by boats falling apart, and then we're not providing a service.
Right.
So that's, I think, where we want to go. But so I would concur, questions that BET members have or RTA members have can funnel them through me, and I can send them to you as part of your analysis. And keep us updated on kind of your progress and your timing and where your touch points are with the public or other agencies.
Sure. So for the questions that you sent us today, obviously we're in the hunt for Memorial Day weekend and a few things going on. So we'll get
They're
those.
not immediate yet.
We'll get those to
Right.
you in the near
Okay.
future. And if you get some more along the way based on this conversation, please forward them to us. We'll try to address those. But at some point, maybe, prior to the budget season, again, coming upon us in September, we could have a thought, some additional conversation to say, we've got advanced some of the information, we steer this in a different direction, which one we want to go in, and start to think about planning for the outer years a little bit, within the next 5 years or so.
That makes sense. And I'll send the questions that were submitted to the other BET members so you can see what's been asked thus far.
Okay? Yeah, obviously, what we have is that the gentlemen have completed their task by making the presentation tonight. Race is on contract with the town, so they have a contract with the town and so we can call on their services if we need some more information. And Tom is great at kind of pulling all this stuff together, so we'll work in-house, and if we need some, different consulting information from the folks, we can get that too. I don't see it as being a problem. Excuse me, I didn't hear. Yes. For this? Well, they know that we have done the plan. We'll make a presentation to them. Right now, they're working on some other issues, but it is in their queue. I mean, we're working on fields, and we have that report to do. We have the Easton Civic Center. We have the rink. We got a lot of things going on. So we figured, this was a commitment we made to the BET, but they will be informed about this plan, and we will give them copies and see if they can generate some questions also. They're good liaisons to the community, and they hear a lot of things about what the folks want. So obviously, we should draw them in at some point. Thank you.